After 2 years of marriage, I finally found out I was pregnant. But my husband brought home an 8-year-old girl who called him daddy. Discovering that I was pregnant was quite unexpected. The main culprit was a bowl of dumpling filling made by my mom. It was a bowl of filling that smelled meaty and delicious to her, but made me feel nauseous. I asked my mom if the filling had gone bad. She asked me, "Are you pregnant?" I was completely bewildered. What? Can pregnancy cause dumpling filling to go bad? My mom rolled her eyes dramatically. "Once you're pregnant, you'll be foolish for 3 years, no doubt about it." Haha, really unbelievable. My mom was decisive. She immediately put down the dumpling filling and took me to the hospital for a checkup. The whole process was quick, so quick that when I received the diagnosis report, I was still in shock. I was really pregnant. I had been married to Oliver for 2 years. During the first year, we deliberately used contraception, mainly because we wanted to enjoy our time as a couple. 2 months ago, at the request of both our parents, we finally compromised and started to create conditions for having children. Little did we know that as soon as we started, we hit the jackpot. It was indeed immediate and effective. Although I didn't have strong feelings about having children before, when the prospect of a baby actually arrived, a wave of joy naturally filled my heart. Perhaps this is what motherhood feels like. I called Oliver right away, but the call indicated that his phone was off. I slapped my forehead and suddenly remembered that he should be on a flight back at that time. He had gone on a business trip to France 3 days ago and was returning today. In my excitement, I completely forgot about it. But I really wanted to share this good news with him. I imagined he would be stunned at first, then overjoyed, and subsequently at a loss for words. I envisioned countless reactions from Oliver upon hearing the news, but I never expected the real situation to be even more dramatic. I waited at home for 2.5 hours. At 4:27 p.m., I received a call from Oliver. He said he had landed and asked where I was. I told him I was at home and couldn't contain my joy as I said, "Hurry back. I have good news to tell you." Oliver didn't respond to my excitement. Instead, he was silent for a few seconds before saying, "I have something to tell you too." His tone was off, making my heart drop. I asked him what it was. He said he would tell me when he got back. His heavy tone disrupted my mood, and after hanging up, I felt as if a stone had been pressed on my heart, leaving me feeling stuffy and anxious. Oliver and I grew up together as childhood friends. Although we had some separations in between, after so many years together, we knew each other too well. As soon as he spoke, I could tell that it was something difficult for him. And in all these years, there were very few things that could put Oliver in a bind. The last time was when we broke up. So what could it be this time? I joked with myself, surely, he doesn't want to divorce me. If he proposed a divorce right when I found out I was pregnant, that would be too ironic. Oliver arrived home at 5:30 p.m. With a beep sound, the fingerprint unlock succeeded. It was Oliver. I quickly stood up and walked to the entrance to wait for him. The door was pushed open from the outside. "You're back." My voice stopped abruptly, and even my smile froze. What did I just see? Oliver walked in holding a little girl's hand? A flood of guesses rushed into my mind, but in the end, I felt completely lost. Instinctively, I took 2 steps back and asked warily, "Who is she?" Oliver looked at me with a complicated expression, and I couldn't quite figure out what it meant at that moment. He said, "Her name is Ruby, and she's 7 years old." I felt like my brain had been struck by lightning. "You're?" I almost squeezed those words out between my teeth. Oliver quickly shook his head. "No," I admit. I breathed a sigh of relief, and my tightly clenched hands slowly relaxed. It was then that I started to look at the girl Oliver was holding. She clutched Oliver tightly, half her body hiding behind him. Her eyes were downcast, and she looked tense, displaying a clear lack of security. When I looked at her, she instinctively shivered and tightened her grip on Oliver's hand again. Oliver soothingly said, "It's okay, don't be afraid. This is Daddy's wife." I quickly looked up at Oliver, doubting I had heard him correctly. "What did you say? Daddy? Didn't you say she wasn't your child?" I admit I was agitated, my voice sharp and piercing. As soon as I finished speaking, a small whimper broke out, quickly turning into suppressed sobs. It was Ruby. I had scared her into crying, her face a picture of wanting to cry but holding back. She was incredibly pitiful, but it only made my heart feel more upset. Maybe this was just a matter of chemistry. Ruby and I were clearly not meant to get along. Oliver frowned and looked at me. He was blaming me. My heart felt a sting. Before I could say anything, he had already crouched down to patiently and gently comfort Ruby. A surge of overwhelming emotions welled up inside me. Without thinking too much, I turned and walked out. I have never been one to compromise my feelings, especially now that I was pregnant and my emotions were already unstable. Just as I was about to leave, Oliver suddenly grabbed my arm. Diana, it's not what you think. Give me some time, and I will explain everything. I looked deeply at Oliver, his expression was serious. He wasn't lying. After holding back my emotions, I broke free from his grasp and went upstairs. I'll be waiting for you in the bedroom. Oliver and I have known each other since we were 6 years old. Back then, he was a porcelain doll, while I was a wild little monkey. I've always been unconventional. While other little girls liked playing on slides, seesaws, and swings, I was into rock climbing, roller skating, and taekwondo. I thought I would always be a tomboy, but a magical moment happened the first time I went to an amusement park with Oliver. My mom said I held Oliver's hand and went down the slide with him, not only looking terrified but also sweetly saying, "Brother, I'm scared." I don't remember this, but I believe it could have happened. After all, I had been a loyal admirer of Oliver since childhood. There was no helping it, he was just too good-looking, like a child star from TV. Through my relentless persistence, I became Oliver's best friend. We went to school together, had meals together, and did homework together. Sometimes, when our parents weren't home, we would hide under the same blanket for comfort. At that young age, we didn't know what forever meant, but we promised to be together for a lifetime. However, all of that came to a halt during high school. He moved to another city with his parents while I stayed behind without even a word of goodbye. This clearly showed that childhood promises didn't hold water. Just as I was lost in thought, Oliver walked in. I looked at my watch, it had been 20 minutes. Go ahead. Oliver handed me a piece of paper, saying, "This is the paternity test. Ruby and I are not related by blood." I took the report expressionlessly, and the final conclusion confirmed Oliver's words. However, the report did nothing to calm my emotions. I set the paper aside and said, "Oliver, just tell me directly. Don't wait for me to ask." I didn't like this toothpaste squeezing style of conversation, and more importantly, I didn't know where to start. Oliver seemed unsure of how to begin either. After a long pause, he finally spoke up, "Ruby is Clara's daughter." "Clara. I know her. We have met once." Even though it was only one meeting, I remembered it vividly. When I saw her, she was on her tiptoes, gently kissing Oliver. Oliver and I parted ways during high school, and by the time we met again, it was in our senior year. At that time, he transferred to our class. The moment I saw him, I was stunned. He had changed significantly since childhood. Though his features still resembled the boy I once knew, he appeared more heroic and handsome. The key difference was his aura, cold and distant, as if keeping people at arm's length. For a moment, I couldn't be sure if this was the Oliver I knew. What made it even harder to confirm was whether he still remembered me after 2 years apart. But he said, "Diana, I'm back." He was still my Oliver. We ended up together during this crucial time in high school. In our senior year, with time running short and tasks piling up, we balanced studying frantically with sneaking in moments of romance. We savored the bittersweet taste of first love to the extent that we overlooked many existing problems. For instance, we compromised against our true feelings for each other, and we hid conflicts that could have been resolved. All of this exploded after we entered university. We fought, went into cold wars, and wore each other down. In the end, we broke up. We had only been in university for 3 months. What we thought would be a future filled with mutual support turned out to be a separation, forgotten like strangers. During that time, I was in pain, struggling for 4 months until I couldn't hold back and went looking for him. But when I reached his dorm building, I saw a girl kissing him. That girl was Clara. Oliver said Clara suddenly contacted him a month ago, wanting to see him, but he had refused. A week ago, she called again, saying she had cancer, late stage, and was about to die. She wanted to see Oliver one last time. This time, Oliver agreed. His words left me stunned. Oliver's face darkened as he continued, she passed away. Breast cancer. By the time it was discovered, it was already in the late stage. Even with chemotherapy and surgery, they couldn't extend her life. I stood frozen in place, unsure how to react. People leave this world every moment, death is a norm of life. But when the departed is someone you once knew, the feeling is different. There's nostalgia, regret, and a sense of loss. And I felt a mix of emotions. First, for Clara's passing, and second, for the child she left behind. Looking at Oliver, I said, I'm very sorry, but I still want to ask you, why? Why did she want to see you one last time? Why did she leave her child to you? Why does this child have no blood relationship with you, yet she is connected to you by blood? If I remember correctly, you told me that you weren't together, and she went abroad after we got back together. Oliver saw me and pushed Clara away as he caught up with me. He said, Diana, I can explain. But I responded angrily, there's nothing to explain. We've already broken up. You're free to start a new relationship. Oliver looked at me in disbelief. Is that really how you feel? No, that's not how I felt. I was incredibly jealous and heartbroken. But my useless pride made me nod. I said yes, that's what I thought. Oliver let go of my hand and said, as you can see, she is my girlfriend. We both knew we were just saying hurtful things to each other. But we were genuinely hurting each other. We were both stubborn, unwilling to back down. It wasn't until I was hospitalized for appendicitis that our relationship finally broke the ice. He finally explained Clara's existence to me. Clara was Oliver's admirer. Unlike others, she was very public about it and even claimed that there was no wall she couldn't break down. That day, Clara came to find Oliver under the pretense of a club event. When Oliver wasn't paying attention, she suddenly kissed him. Oliver immediately tried to push her away, but just then, I appeared as he was about to do so. Oliver said that after that incident, he clearly expressed his stance to Clara, stating that he had no further connection with her. But now it seemed that things were clearly not so simple. Did Oliver lie to me? The thought crossed my mind for just a second, yet it caused me immense pain. Oliver fell silent. Sometimes silence hurts more than the truth. I tightened my hands at my sides. Oliver, you should have thought about this when you brought the child back. Some things can't be avoided. Oliver closed his eyes and opened them again after a few seconds. He said, I didn't intend to avoid it, I just didn't know how to start. Oliver asked me, do you remember what I said to you in anger? I did remember. He said, I know that was said in anger, and even you know it was just words of anger. But Clara took it seriously. Oliver once told me, as you can see, she is my girlfriend. Clara took it seriously. She began to present herself as Oliver's girlfriend, publicizing their supposed relationship everywhere. She flattered and befriended Oliver's classmates and friends. By the time Oliver realized what was happening, everyone believed they were genuinely dating. Clara stood before Oliver, holding a bouquet of flowers, saying that today was the 1-month anniversary of their relationship, and this was a surprise for her boyfriend. Everyone excitedly watched the scene, cheering and shouting, "Kiss her! Kiss her!" Oliver was furious at Clara's stunt. He exposed her in front of everyone and declared that they had never been together and that the so-called relationship was just her imagination. Oliver said, at that moment, I didn't think much of it, I just wanted to end the farce. But Clara suffered public scrutiny because of it. The ridicule and mockery from everyone became unbearable for her. She was ultimately forced to transfer schools and went abroad as an exchange student. But going abroad didn't save Clara, instead, it plunged her into despair. In an unfamiliar environment, far from home, she soon developed bipolar disorder. Later, after a night of heavy drinking, she was assaulted and became pregnant by a stranger. By the time she realized she was pregnant, the baby was already forming. And due to health reasons, this could be her only child. So she decided to have the baby. To support the child, she dropped out of school and took up a job. With the weight of pressure and pent-up feelings, her health deteriorated. Oliver said, "She went through all of this because of me, and raising Ruby was her last wish. Diana, I had to do this." I fell silent. I initially thought this was an emotional issue, but it had now transformed into a question of values. After a long while, I finally regained my voice. I said, "Clara has parents, we can give the child to them, and we will pay for the support." Oliver replied, "When Clara decided to keep the child, she severed ties with her parents, they didn't want this child. But this is their daughter's child, blood is thicker than water, they can't just give it up." Oliver remained silent. His silence told me that he disagreed with this suggestion. My nails dug into my palm. I said, "Or we can find her a good adoptive family. Similarly, we will pay for the support." Oliver looked at me, frustration evident on his face. He said, "How can you be sure that an adoptive family will treat her well? She is just an 8-year-old child, and we are fully capable of adopting her. Why don't you agree?" "Because I'm pregnant." I suddenly stood up, trembling as I yelled at him. But Oliver instinctively looked towards the door and then said to me, "Diana, keep your voice down." His reaction made me both furious and amused. I grabbed a cushion from the sofa and threw it at him. "Oliver, you really are something." After that, I stood up and walked out. "Diana." Oliver tried to stop me again, and I shouted, "Don't touch me." His hand froze in place. I opened the door and collided directly with the small figure standing outside. She fell to the ground. I quickly reached out to help her. But she seemed to see me as a monster, pushing herself away with her hands and crying loudly. Oliver brushed past my arm and ran out of the room. He crouched down and helped Ruby up, asking anxiously, "Are you hurt? Do you think he's sick?" I'm pregnant, and he didn't react at all, but when that kid fell, he was worried sick. With that kind of reaction, does he really think the child isn't his? Do you believe that? I really don't know what he's thinking. Even if he wants to help, he doesn't have to take on the responsibility himself. We have countless ways to handle this, yet he chooses the most unacceptable option. What does he really want? Does he want to give up? If he doesn't want to, then let's separate. Divorce. Not daring to tell my parents, I could only go to my best friend's house. Once I was there, I finally lost control of my emotions and shouted angrily. My friend comforted me, saying, "Calm down, don't be so angry. Don't you think your reaction is too much?" Hearing this, I paused, my hand holding the cup still. I didn't want to react this way, but Oliver's behavior was too triggering. His refusal to my suggestion, his indifference when I told him I was pregnant, and finally, how he didn't even look up when I left. With Ruby's appearance, Oliver's attitude did a complete 180. This had never happened before. I always felt he was hiding something from me. I said to my friend, "You don't understand." My friend sighed and said, "Haven't you thought about accepting this child? After all, you can afford it." I shook my head decisively. That child hates me. I have no reason to bring such a nuisance upon myself. I recalled the look in that child's eyes when she first looked at me, disgust, hatred, it was a gaze that could not evoke any joy. I didn't know why the child felt such strong emotions towards me. But I knew I couldn't accept it. With all these thoughts swirling in my mind, I didn't sleep well that night. The next day, Oliver came looking for me. I pulled out my phone to check the time, "I'm going to be late." Oliver said, "I'll give you a ride." I didn't refuse. Once I got into the car, just as we drove out of the community, Oliver couldn't help but speak up. He said, "Ruby is introverted, timid, and weak. Clara entrusted her to me on her deathbed. I couldn't just ignore her. A child's upbringing is influenced by their family for a lifetime. Diana, don't rush to conclusions. Just spend some time with her, okay? I let out a long sigh. Oliver, have you already forgotten what I told you yesterday? Oliver was taken aback, looking completely confused. His reaction hurt me. Pull over. Diana. I said, pull over. Seeing my determination, Oliver pulled the car to the side. I got out and slammed the door hard. I took a few quick steps forward but then suddenly stopped, turned around, and walked back. Through the car window, I said to Oliver, I'm pregnant, and I told you that yesterday. But from yesterday until today, you haven't said a single word of concern. Is the child okay? How old is he? What should I pay attention to? Don't you care at all? Oliver, you really disappoint me. I'm laying it all out now. If you want to adopt this child, fine, we'll get a divorce. When I mentioned divorce, Oliver's expression instantly turned cold. He said, Diana, after all these years, can't you change that habit of speaking without thinking? I sneered, do you think I'm just trying to spite you? We parted on bad terms. 3 days went by without any contact. On the 4th day, Oliver waited for me downstairs at my office. When he saw me come out, he said, let's go home. After all these years, from dating to marriage, we knew each other's routines inside out. Oliver was trying to give me an out. In the past, I would have eagerly taken it. This time, it was a matter of who would back down. I pretended not to see him and turned to leave. Oliver hurriedly caught up to me. Diana, what do you want? Looking into his suppressed eyes, I asked, what about the child? Is she gone? He remained silent. Then we have nothing more to discuss. Let's get a divorce. Diana. Oliver shouted softly. I coldly met his gaze. She's just a child, why can't you accept her? I hadn't planned to say much, but in the end, I couldn't hold back. I should be asking you this, why do you insist on adopting her? Oliver fell silent again. I walked past him in disappointment. Out of his sight, my hand rested on my belly. Once again, he had nothing to say about the life we had created together. Disappointment and sadness filled me. I felt terrible. I found a lawyer and entrusted him to draft a divorce agreement. My friend advised me not to act impulsively. She thought my emotions were influenced by the pregnancy. Impulsive? Maybe. But more than that, it was a well-considered decision. Oliver's attitude troubled me. If he could discuss this rationally with me, perhaps I would have impulsively agreed to let him raise her. But he was emotionally completely on Ruby's side, even the child in my belly couldn't sway him. Such an attitude was heartbreaking. I had to consider the worst-case scenario. When my child is born, and he and Ruby are on opposite sides of the scale, who will Oliver choose? I should have a child with complete paternal love. Why should I be the one chosen? Just as I was preparing to hand the divorce agreement to Oliver, his phone rang. His voice was tired and hoarse. He said, I've sent the child to Clara's parents. I was so surprised. I didn't expect that the previously adamant Oliver would compromise, and so quickly. I followed him back home, and he hugged me, saying, Diana, I was wrong before. Because of Clara's death, my emotions were affected, and I neglected you and the child. I'm sorry. I seriously thought about what you said. I was being stubborn. I apologize. His apology made me feel so aggrieved. I couldn't help but pout and cry, you don't care about me or the child. How can you do this? Seeing me cry, Oliver was at a loss for how to comfort me. I'm sorry, Diana, it's all my fault. It won't happen again. After so many days of pent-up emotions, I finally had an outlet at that moment. When I finally calmed down, Oliver wiped my tears and said earnestly, if you're angry, you can hit me, you can scold me, just don't say divorce. I glared at him. What will you do if there's a next time? Oliver glared back. Do you want there to be a next time? I felt wronged. Can you blame me for this? Oliver sighed. Blame me. He hugged me again and gently placed his hand on my belly. He asked, how is the baby? Let's go to the hospital for a checkup tomorrow, okay? That night, we held each other tightly, filled with warmth, as if all the barriers and conflicts had vanished in that moment. But I knew they hadn't. On our nightstand, I saw a storybook. In the shoe cabinet, there were several pairs of fluffy rabbit slippers. On the table was a cute glass. The coffee table was scattered with candies and cookies. In the fridge, there was a leftover strawberry cake. There was even a Barbie doll hidden behind the cushions on the sofa. In just a few days, Ruby seemed to be everywhere. Looking at these things reminded me that while I was in endless pain, Oliver was at home soothing someone else's daughter. But I didn't react at all. I wasn't someone who made a fuss. In this matter, Oliver had already made a concession, so why should I be aggressive? These things would slowly disappear. Or so I thought. But unexpected events always strike suddenly. Ruby broke her arm and was hospitalized. Today is the 7th day since Oliver sent Ruby away. As usual, he came to pick me up after work, and on the way, he asked what I wanted to eat. But before I could answer, his phone rang. Seeing the caller ID, his brows furrowed, and he quickly answered the call. "What's wrong?" he asked. The person on the other end must have said something alarming because Oliver slammed on the brakes. "How did you take care of the child?" "Don't explain, I'll be there right away." Oliver looked at me. "Diana, I need to go to the hospital. Is it okay if I drop you off at home first?" He said the call was from Clara's mother, who told him Ruby had broken her arm but refused to let the doctor treat her. She had no choice but to call Oliver. Women are so strange. When he thought of me first, I didn't mind as much. I said, "I'll go with you." Oliver looked at me in surprise, then grasped my hand tightly. "Diana, you're really wonderful." We rushed to the hospital as quickly as we could. As we approached, we heard a piercing scream. Oliver stopped in his tracks and quickly ran forward. There were many people in the hospital room, doctors, nurses, and an elderly couple. Opposite them stood a tense Ruby, her small body pressed against the wall, as if she was in a state of battle. Whenever someone tried to approach, she would scream in terror. It wasn't until Oliver pushed through the crowd that he softly called out, "Ruby." Ruby looked at Oliver sharply, her lips moved, then she closed her eyes and fainted. She was calling Daddy. Oliver hurriedly caught her, and the doctors and nurses quickly rushed forward. The doctor said Ruby had been sleep-deprived and had passed out. As for her arm, it was fractured. And because she had been struggling, it was misaligned and would require surgery. She was soon taken into the operating room. Oliver, with a serious face, questioned Clara's parents. "How did Ruby get hurt?" Clara's mother avoided eye contact and said, "The child wouldn't listen, she climbed onto the table and fell." "And what about the sleep deprivation?" "How would I know? She refuses to sleep at night, what can I do?" As she spoke, she glared at Oliver. "Didn't you say she isn't your blood? Since you don't want to raise her, why do you care so much? You can leave now." Finally, Clara's father spoke up, "All right, enough. If he leaves, what will Ruby do later when she starts crying? Can you calm her down?" Clara's mother rolled her eyes. "A thankless little beast." That remark angered not only Oliver but also me. Oliver coldly withdrew his gaze, unwilling to engage further with them. He asked me if I wanted him to take me home first. I refused and chose to wait with him outside the operating room. 2.5 hours later, Ruby was brought out. Her eyes were tightly closed, she was still unconscious. Seeing Oliver and me waiting, Clara's parents left, saying they were going home for dinner. "Don't you worry about the child at all?" I couldn't help but ask. She casually said, "Aren't you here? If you're leaving, get her a caretaker," then turned and left without looking back. I thought this was the worst of it, but when Ruby woke up, I realized things were even worse than I imagined. Ruby said she climbed onto the table because she was hungry. There was nothing to eat at home, just a box of cookies on the shelf. As for the sleep deprivation, she said she was always alone at home every night and felt scared. Clara's parents didn't have stable jobs, they lived off demolition compensation and rent. Every night, They would go out to play cards, returning home as early as 11 or 12 and sometimes staying out all night. Ruby held Oliver's hand, quietly pleading, "Daddy, can I live with you?" Oliver froze, turning to me with a look of desperation. Ruby seemed to realize something. She lowered her head and released Oliver's hand. My heart softened. I even began to question my initial decision. If it weren't for me, this child wouldn't have to suffer so much. I said, "Okay." Oliver looked at me in disbelief. "Diana, thank you." Oliver gently said to Ruby, "Ruby, from now on, you can live with Daddy. Are you happy?" A big smile appeared on Ruby's pale face as she nodded vigorously, then responded loudly, Ruby, thank you, Mommy." With those words, Ruby and I fell silent. Seeing Ruby's obvious resistance, I quickly said, "No need to call me that. You can just call me Auntie." Ruby looked at me and shyly smiled, "Thank you, Auntie." Oliver worked quickly. He not only convinced Clara's parents but also secured Ruby's residency. During this time, I stayed in the hospital with Ruby. She was very well behaved, and all the doctors and nurses liked her. She treated me very well, even trying to please me. The look of disdain that used to be there never appeared again. This made me feel quite mixed inside. I thought perhaps my prejudice against this child had been too great. After a month and a half in the hospital, Ruby recovered quickly. During this time, it was mainly Oliver and the caregivers who took care of her. I visited occasionally, and each time she would give me a big apple. Later, Oliver told me that this apple was the biggest and reddest one she had saved just for me. I admit I was touched. Oliver hugged me, saying, "Once the baby is born, Ruby will have a sister." How wonderful. As time passed, I reached my 3rd month of pregnancy. Before Ruby was discharged, Oliver accompanied me for my first prenatal checkup. We did an ultrasound, had blood tests, and underwent other routine examinations. Everything was normal. Everything seemed to be moving in a good direction. I told Oliver, "Don't tell Ruby about my pregnancy just yet, let her adjust for a while before we say anything." Just as Oliver had said, Ruby indeed lacked a sense of security, which was evident from her attempts to please me. If I told her I was pregnant now, she might feel pretty bad about it. Oliver also thought of this but didn't know how to express it to me. Now that I brought it up, he visibly relaxed. He said, "Diana, thank you. There's no need to be so polite. Since I've decided to adopt her, I will treat her well. You don't have to worry." I genuinely wanted to be good to Ruby. I set up a pink room for her, bought clothes for all seasons, and all the daily necessities were chosen according to a little girl's preferences. I even entrusted her schooling to my mom. It was then that they found out about Ruby. My mom didn't quite agree, but my dad stopped her. My dad said, "Raising a child isn't as easy as you think, especially since she has such a connection with Oliver, and now you're pregnant. If you've made this decision, you have to take on the responsibility." I asked myself if I was ready to take on that responsibility. But soon I realized something was off. Because Ruby's hand hadn't fully healed and Oliver and I both had to work, we hired a nanny to take care of her. At first, everything was fine, calm and harmonious. I have a habit of drinking milk for an hour before bed, something I've maintained for years. When Ruby had been living with us for half a month, I went to the kitchen to prepare my milk as usual. But as soon as I stepped in, my foot suddenly slipped, and I lost control, falling backward. I quickly braced myself against the doorframe, managing to steady myself and avoid falling. But even so, my heart raced. I loudly called for Oliver. He was startled and immediately scooped me up, placing me on the sofa. When he went to check the kitchen, he found a layer of grease on the floor, which was the culprit behind my fall. Our faces were grim. Oliver immediately called the nanny, questioning how she could let this happen. But the nanny repeatedly explained that she had cleaned thoroughly and insisted she wouldn't make such a rookie mistake. Yet, where did that grease come from? That was unknown. We could only assume it was an accident on the nanny's part. Just a mishap. A mishap that we quickly forgot. A week later, Oliver and I went to the city to attend a friend's wedding banquet. We left that day and returned the next day. When we got home, Ruby was very happy and ran over to hug us. She charged toward me like a little firecracker. Her stance seemed as if she intended to headbutt something. I was scared and quickly protected my belly. Fortunately, Oliver intervened and stopped her. Even so, she still propelled forward, showcasing her strength. Oliver's face also looked a bit stiff as he said, "Ruby, be more careful in the future." Ruby replied with an "oh," looking at me blankly, then nodded obediently, saying, "I understand." For a moment, I had doubts. Did Ruby know I was pregnant? Did she intend to bump into me on purpose? But that thought felt a bit malicious and was quickly suppressed. This incident passed without much issue. What truly bothered me was that night. It was a stormy night when Ruby knocked on our door. She said she was scared and wanted to sleep with us. Oliver asked for my opinion, and I agreed. Ruby happily lay down between us. After a few words, we all started to doze off. Suddenly, a loud clap of thunder made Ruby scream, and she accidentally kicked me in the stomach. A sharp pain shot through me, and I cried out, "Oliver." Ruby's kick sent me straight to the hospital. Although there was no bleeding, the abdominal pain persisted. After a series of examinations, the doctor said there were signs of a threatened miscarriage and recommended that I be hospitalized for treatment to protect the pregnancy. So, I stayed in the hospital. The doctor said seriously, "Pregnancy isn't as fragile as we imagine. Small bumps and bruises won't have a significant impact. However, the force of the kick you received was considerable. If someone did this on purpose, you can choose to report it." With that, she cast a significant glance at Oliver. Oliver, feeling helpless, said, "It was just the child at home who got startled while sleeping and accidentally kicked her." The doctor understood and advised, "If that's the case, just be careful to avoid the child in the future. But that kid does have a strong kick." The doctor's words were careless, but I took them to heart. Oliver occasionally took out his phone, seemingly replying to messages. I asked him what was wrong. He said Ruby wasn't doing well. Because of my persistent abdominal pain, both Oliver and I were frightened. At that moment, Ruby was also emotional, crying as she clung to Oliver. Oliver had no choice but to temporarily leave her with a couple from our neighborhood while he hurried me to the hospital. They said Ruby has been crying and won't let them get close. Her mental state seems a bit off. So? I coldly retorted. Oliver was taken aback. "What?" He frowned at me and asked, "Diana, what's wrong?" I asked Oliver, "Did you tell Ruby about my pregnancy?" The implication in my words was too obvious, and Oliver immediately bristled like a hedgehog. "Diana, what do you mean? Do you suspect Ruby did this on purpose? She's only 8 years old, how can you think that of her?" His tone was very aggressive, but I still held back my anger and tried to analyze it with him. The doctor said the force of this kick was considerable. She even suspects it was intentional, which means, before I could finish, Oliver interrupted me. "Ruby was scared by the thunder, how could she possibly do it on purpose? Didn't you see how hard she was crying?" I replied, "She said she was scared of the thunder, but before coming to our room, she didn't scream or shout. Instead, she made such a big fuss only under the protection of 2 adults. Do you think that's normal?" I continued, "She was lying flat. If she was startled, she would have kicked with both feet at the same time." "Did she kick you?" Oliver blurted out, "Yes." "You're lying." I was holding my breath in frustration. I tried to explain calmly so that he could rationally face the situation. But it was clear he couldn't. My heart sank at that moment. I looked at Oliver in disappointment, his gaze was evasive. Just then, Oliver's phone rang. Ruby's cries came through. From the occasional snippets I overheard, I could infer that Ruby was admitting her mistake, seeking Oliver's reassurance that he wouldn't abandon her. Oliver comforted her gently. After a few ineffective words of comfort, his expression visibly turned anxious. "Ruby, don't be afraid, Daddy will be back soon." After hanging up, Oliver hesitated as he looked at me. He said, "Diana, can I hire a caregiver for you?" I genuinely didn't expect Oliver to say that. Our child nearly had a miscarriage, and I had to lie in bed to protect the pregnancy, yet he wanted to leave. I clenched my hands tightly. "You can go." That was said out of anger. I hoped he would hear the sulkiness in my tone and feel hurt, then compromise and stay, apologizing for his actions. But he really left. When I heard the door close, my tears finally fell uncontrollably. My mother often said I was too rigid. She said every time we argued, I would confront Oliver, yet afterwards, I would hide away and cry, which was useless. She said a child who cries gets candy, so if I wanted to cry, I should do it in front of Oliver so that he would feel pity. But she didn't understand that I never cried to make him feel sorry. I just felt sad. After all these years with Oliver, I had invested significant emotional capital in him, so I hoped for reciprocal feelings, not pity obtained through calculation and manipulation. That would degrade both me and our relationship. I shook my head, pulling myself from my thoughts, and began to contemplate Ruby's situation. One event might be a coincidence, but if it happened repeatedly, it was definitely intentional. In 20 days, 3 times the accidents no longer convinced me. Especially the first time. I recalled carefully that after the nanny finished cleaning and left, I had gone into the kitchen, and there was no grease then. But the second time I went in, there was. This was clearly unrelated to the nanny. So, who else could it be? Initially, I regretted not adopting Ruby because of my prejudices against her. Now, I regretted adopting her. I have always looked down on regret. Once something happens, it's better to bear the consequences and find a solution rather than dwell on regret, which is utterly useless. Yet Ruby shattered my long-held values. Now, I didn't know what to do. But regardless, I first needed to have a serious talk with Oliver. At the very least, we had to reach a consensus about Ruby. What I didn't expect, though, was that since that night Oliver left, he had not appeared again. Not a single phone call, not a word of explanation. He seemed to have vanished into thin air. At first, I was very angry. I stubbornly confronted him alone. Since he didn't contact me, I wouldn't contact him either. But by the third day, I began to worry. I was worried that something had happened to him or that there was some kind of accident. Finally, unable to hold back, I dialed his number. No one answered the first call. My heart sank. I immediately dialed a second call. Just when I thought the second call wouldn't be answered either, Oliver's weary and hoarse voice came through. "Diana? Where are you?" I asked. Oliver said, "The hospital." He said Ruby was having mental issues, and they were now in the psychiatric department. Before Oliver could finish explaining, I heard Ruby's terrified screams on the other end. In the next moment, the call was abruptly disconnected. I sat in bed in a daze, feeling a mix of emotions. Oliver was in the hospital, the same hospital as me, but in a different building. Even so, it was only a 5-minute walk. Yet he hadn't come to see me even once. A chill settled deep in my heart. At that moment, the only thought screaming in my mind was, divorce. My body had mostly recovered, and I could get out of bed. I put on my coat and went straight to the psychiatric department. It didn't take long for me to find Ruby's room. Looking through the glass window, I saw Ruby lying in bed with her eyes closed, giving off a fragile and lifeless aura. Oliver sat at the bedside, one hand holding Ruby's hand while the other rubbed his temples. He looked haggard, with messy hair, as if he hadn't slept at all. The nurse said Ruby's condition was very poor. She had clearly experienced great fear. She was not only suffering from insomnia and anxiety but also screamed and hurt others, even showing tendencies toward self-isolation. No one could get close to her except Oliver. Anyone who approached her would be scratched or even bitten. She was very sensitive, and Oliver had to stay right by her side. If he attempted to leave, she would wake up and cause a scene. So for these past few days, neither Ruby nor Oliver had slept a full night. I asked the nurse, "Is it possible she's faking it?" The nurse looked at me in surprise, her eyes showing hesitation. Are you really the child's mother? I nodded expressionlessly. The nurse's previously friendly demeanor shifted subtly. She said, "How could such a young child possibly fake it? And not sleeping? If it were you, you wouldn't be able to stand it either. If the child has problems, parents need to understand." With that, she left without looking back. I could tell she probably thought I was a terrible mother. Without seeing Oliver, I left directly. Then I completed the discharge procedures and left the hospital alone. As soon as I was discharged, I didn't go home but went to Clara's parents' place. I knocked on the door, but no one answered. I knocked a few more times, and finally, the door opened. A middle-aged woman stepped out and said, "Stop knocking. If you're looking for Clara, she's at the mahjong parlor downstairs." I thanked her and followed her directions to the parlor. Clara's parents were all gathered around the mahjong table. When Clara's mother saw me, she paused for a moment, then casually said, "What? Can't raise her well again, and you want to return her to us?" "I'm telling you, I won't take her back." I said, "I want to talk to you." She replied, "I don't have time." "Well, I'll wait for you." With that, I sat down beside her. The people at the mahjong table looked at me curiously, gossiping about who I was. Clara's mother snapped at them to leave me alone and shouted at me to go away. Her father, however, remained silent the whole time, as if it had nothing to do with him. Eventually, Clara's mother couldn't take it anymore, pushed the cards away, and walked outside. I followed her out. "What do you want from me?" I asked her. "How did Ruby hurt her arm?" She said, "Didn't we already tell you? She climbed on the table and fell. She's not a mischievous child, why would she climb on the table?" The woman glared at me. "What do you mean? Are you suspecting us of abusing her? You're not trying to extort us for money, are you?" "I'm telling you, no way." I ignored her words and continued. "Ruby said she was always hungry at your place." As soon as she heard that, the woman stood up angrily. "I said she's an ungrateful little brat, just like her mother." With that, she turned to leave. I hurried to stop her. "I know it's not your fault. I've recently discovered some things about Ruby, and we all want to help her. She's still small, and there's still time to correct things, but we first need to understand the problem." From the trembling tone of the woman's voice and her reddened eyes, I could tell she wasn't completely indifferent to Clara and Ruby. My words made her hesitate, and eventually, she told me everything. She said Ruby refused to eat any food they prepared for her, whether meat or vegetables, mild or spicy, she refused all of it. After refusing to eat, she would secretly take cookies to fill her stomach. At first, they turned a blind eye, but after it happened too many times, they couldn't stand it anymore. They wanted to correct her bad habits, so they forced her to eat and put all the snacks in the house out of reach. But she still wouldn't eat and would climb on the table to get cookies. When they found her, they told her to get down, but she jumped down directly. That's how she broke her arm. As for her sleep issues, the couple indeed had a habit of playing cards, but since Ruby arrived, they had never gone out together again, always leaving one at home to watch the child. They really didn't know Ruby wasn't sleeping because she refused to share a room with them, she insisted on sleeping alone. Finally, she said, "We didn't raise her well. Her mother was always up to no good, she stole our money and went abroad. After so many years, she didn't even call. Now she's dead, leaving behind this little one, just like her mother. We can't teach her. You all, just figure it out." Looking at her back, I noticed she had gotten even thinner than before, her whole back even hunched over. Sometimes what we see may not reflect the truth. I turned off the recording on my phone and saved the audio properly. Then I returned home to wait for their return. On the third day, Oliver brought Ruby home. 2 days ago, Oliver spoke to me on the phone. He explained that he also wanted to see me, but Ruby couldn't be left alone. As soon as he reached the elevator, she would wake up and start crying. After hearing this, I merely responded with a faint "hm." Oliver noticed the abnormal tone in my voice. After a moment of silence, he said, "Diana, I know you're upset. Once Ruby is discharged, You can vent your frustrations however you want. For these days at home, take care of yourself. I only replied with another before hanging up. We were both adults, we had long passed the age of being moved by sweet words. It wasn't enough for him to say a few touching things, what I needed was genuine companionship and care, which he clearly couldn't provide at the moment. Ruby had become increasingly thin, as if she had shrunk from water. Even her once fair cheeks now appeared waxy and yellow. Oliver didn't look much better, either. He seemed utterly dejected. If someone didn't know any better, they might think they had escaped from a famine. Oliver said to me, "Diana, this incident was Ruby's fault. She has learned her lesson. I apologize on her behalf, please forgive her this once." I ignored what Oliver said and focused on Ruby. She glanced at me, her eyes somewhat numb and dazed, but quickly hid behind Oliver. I said, "Do you want to apologize to me? Then you should do it yourself." Ruby let out a whimper and immediately clutched Oliver's shirt, trembling all over. Oliver stepped forward, blocking Ruby from view. "Diana, enough." His voice carried a warning, and his gaze was defensive. I looked at Oliver and said calmly, "At home, you can't even let her face the consequences of her actions. When she grows up, will you say all the apologies for her? Oliver, you've gone too far." I went back to my room alone, and Oliver came in at 10 o'clock. I closed the book in my hands and said, "We need to talk." Oliver lay exhausted on the bed and sighed, "Can we do this tomorrow? I'm too tired." "Oliver, I'm not going to wait for you forever." My words made Oliver open his eyes, and he forced himself to sit up. He was indeed very tired. This wasn't the right time for a conversation, but I didn't care. I played the recording of what Clara's mother had said to him. Oliver listened in silence. In the end, he asked me, "What do you want to say?" I paused for a moment, realizing that disappointment in someone could accumulate to this extent. "So you don't think Ruby has any problems?" Oliver looked at me and said, "How can you be sure what they said is true? Even assuming it is true, it only proves they don't care enough about Ruby. It doesn't mean that doing things matters. Children can tell if someone genuinely likes them. So you don't think Ruby has any problems?" I pressed again, emphasizing my tone. Oliver fell silent, silently indicating that he didn't see any issue. How pathetic. "Oliver, you are harming her. Diana, you're the one being biased against her." We parted ways unhappily. I directly got up and went to the guest room. Oliver didn't stop me. As I passed Ruby's room, I saw her slightly ajar door and the darkness within. Oliver slept soundly until the next afternoon. Ruby was awakened by the nanny for lunch. She remained obedient and sensible, eating her meal properly, not letting a single grain of rice fall on the table. However, she no longer tried to please me, even treating me as if I were invisible. In each other's eyes, we were like two transparent people. That day passed quietly and oppressively. In the evening, Oliver took Ruby out for a walk and invited me to join them, but I refused. He looked at me helplessly before finally giving in. The next day, Oliver had to go to work while I stayed home to recuperate. At noon, while the nanny went out to buy groceries, it was just Ruby and me in the entire villa. I came out of my room, preparing to go downstairs. Just as I descended 2 steps, Ruby pushed the door open. "Auntie." She called me softly. I turned to look at her. She took a few steps closer and looked up at me. She said, "Auntie, I hate you. You took my mother's things, our family could have been together happily." At that moment, her gaze toward me was the same as the first time she looked at me, full of disgust, resentment, and hostility, unmasked. So it really wasn't my misunderstanding. I stared at her in shock. "Who told you that?" Ruby seemed not to hear my question, her gaze shifted toward my belly. She said, "Auntie, you can't have a baby. If you don't have a baby, Dad won't want you anymore." So she did know that I was pregnant. I wanted to ask her more, but suddenly she reached out and forcefully pushed me down. However, I didn't fall, I stood my ground steadily. I looked at her expressionlessly. "Ruby, you're too impatient. You should wait until your own body recovers." Ruby looked at her hands with a hint of regret in her eyes. She turned to me, saying earnestly, "I really hate you." With that, she gave me no chance to react and rolled straight down the stairs. I reached out to grab her but only brushed against the edge of her clothing. Ah! It was the nanny. She had returned. The nanny made 3 phone calls. One to Oliver, one to the emergency center, and one to the police. She was quite a decent person. She was convinced I was the one who harmed Ruby, watching me warily and shielding the injured, bleeding Ruby behind her. Through the nanny, I saw Ruby's pale smile at the corner of her mouth. This scene left me feeling disheartened. Since she wasn't in life-threatening danger, I had no intention of staying. I turned and went back to my room, sighing. Ruby, after all, is just an 8-year-old child. She doesn't know that there's something called surveillance in the adult world. And I have never been the kind of person to sit and do nothing. To prove certain things, I installed cameras all over the villa, inside and out, in every corner before they came home. I didn't expect them to come in handy so quickly. The first to arrive was Oliver. He picked up Ruby and was about to run out, but then he heard the nanny say she had called the police. He sternly reprimanded her. "Who told you to call the police?" He picked up his phone to make a call. But I interrupted him. I said, "I didn't push her, do you believe me?" Oliver looked at me in disappointment. "Diana, you've gone too far this time." Well, there was nothing more to say. "Just go," he said. "You're coming with me to the hospital." I smiled slightly and replied, "No need, I'll wait for the police at home." "Diana, stop messing around." I waved my hand dismissively. "Enough, just go, or the one in your arms might get hurt." Oliver looked at me with deep concern, and in the end, he left without looking back. I turned my back to him and never looked back. I had spent 2 years managing this home. And it took me less than 2 hours to empty it. Before leaving, I deleted the fingerprints recorded at the door and took off the wedding ring I had worn for over 700 days and nights. This time I went home and told my parents the whole story. They didn't blame me with, "If I had known this would happen, why didn't I act differently?" They just nodded, encouraging me to follow my heart. The only objection they raised was about the child in my belly. They thought if I decided to divorce, I should let go of the child. But I wasn't willing to. This child had survived under someone else's heavy calculation. Should I just abandon him too? I said, "Let me think about it." I took out the divorce agreement I had drafted earlier. I didn't expect it to come in handy after all. I sent the surveillance video and recordings along with it to Oliver. That afternoon, it was confirmed as delivered. An hour later, Oliver called. I rejected the call. An hour after that, he appeared outside my house. I didn't want to see him. I called him instead. He answered instantly. "Diana," I said, "sign the divorce agreement, and then we'll go to the Civil Affairs Bureau. We shouldn't meet in between." Oliver sounded urgent. "Diana, no, let's talk this over. We can't get divorced, okay?" "No." I hung up the phone and locked myself in my room. In the end, it was my dad who knocked on my door. He said, "Let's part amicably, go and clear things up." Oliver and I arranged to meet at a cafe the next day. By the time I arrived, his coffee cup was nearly empty. This cafe was our secret meeting spot during our senior year in high school, and it still existed after all these years. But the boy who used to sit by the window, basking in the sunlight, had changed beyond recognition. As soon as he saw me, Oliver stood up. He looked straight at me, his gaze intense. He ordered me a cup of milk. He said, "2 sugar cubes, your preferred sweetness." I pushed the milk back, saying, "I can't handle sweetness since I got pregnant." Oliver's face froze, and he stood there in shock. "Oliver, since Ruby arrived, you haven't cared about me at all." Saying this felt overly dramatic. I shook my head. "Never mind, let's not talk about that. Have you signed the divorce agreement?" "Diana, we can't get divorced." I said, "That's impossible." He urged, "I'll send Ruby away. I'll find her a foster family." "Diana, please, let's not get divorced, okay?" I sighed heavily. Oliver, I thought I knew you well, but now I don't understand what you want. You're so smart, you scored 105 points more than I did in the college entrance exam. I don't believe you can't see things that are so obvious to me. But you insist on playing blind. If you genuinely wanted to nurture this child, you wouldn't act this way. So what do you want? To harm her? I've considered many possibilities and conducted countless analyses. The only conclusion I can reach is that you are being irrational and emotional. Oliver, Ruby. Back then, I asked you many questions, and you answered them all, except for one. Why does Ruby have your last name? You didn't tell me. I looked directly at Oliver. So that paternity test report is fake. Ruby is indeed your daughter. Oliver's face turned pale instantly. Everything was clear without saying. For a moment, I didn't know whether to feel sad or relieved. Oliver, let's get divorced. Oliver refused to divorce. With red eyes, he pleaded, Diana, I was wrong, we can't get divorced. Oliver knew me so well. He knew I would find it hard to accept. But he tried to have it both ways, which was greedy. Oliver, let's end it this way, we are not meant to be. But Oliver didn't accept it. He showed up outside my house every day. My parents, unable to stand it, let him in. He would sit downstairs and wait until it was dark to leave. Most of the time, he stood outside for hours, doing futile things. I was so exhausted. Oliver and Ruby, these two names tortured me day and night. Just thinking about Oliver's betrayal 8 years ago made me feel sick to my stomach, making me want to vomit. I wanted a divorce. As quickly as possible. I stepped out to see Oliver. In his dull, gray eyes, a sudden spark of color ignited as he gazed at me intently. Diana. Oliver, let's get a divorce. Oliver shook his head and instinctively took a step back. I said, divorce, or I'll release the video of Ruby pushing me and me falling down the stairs. Oliver turned to me sharply. You wouldn't do that. I looked at him seriously. I would. What about the child? We still have a child. Can you really bear to let him be born without a father? Oliver seemed to grasp at a lifeline. I smiled faintly. When Ruby wanted to harm him, you never thought to protect him. Now you should treat this child as if he has already been killed by Ruby. Oliver's face darkened, his expression filled with pain, despair, and above all, disbelief. It was nothing less than a heart-wrenching betrayal, Oliver agreed. He signed the divorce agreement. On the day we went to the Civil Affairs Bureau, he said to me, I'm not afraid of you exposing the video, I just don't want you to hate me. Diana, please don't hate me. He looked at me with pleading eyes, as if my response was his redemption. In the end, I couldn't give him that. Because I didn't know myself. Would Oliver intentionally hurt me? No. Did Oliver hurt me? Yes. When the damage was done, did intent still matter? Perhaps I didn't hate him as much anymore. But if we continued to entangle ourselves, it would lead to mutual destruction. The day after I received the divorce certificate, I left the country with the child in my belly. He accompanied me as we traveled around, experiencing different customs and cultures. In the end, I gave birth to a big, chubby boy in a small town in Provence. My mom rushed over the next day. She scolded me, blaming me for being such a headache. But in the end, she dutifully cared for me during my confinement. The little chubby boy was quite the handful. He not only had a loud voice but also cried a lot, keeping everyone on their toes. I felt helpless, but my mom was quite happy. She said his loud voice showed vitality, that he had good lung capacity and was healthy, and that he would definitely grow up tall and handsome. I laughed in disbelief. Could a loud voice really determine his bright future? Isn't the affection from grandparents a bit too exaggerated? After we managed to get through the confinement period in a chaotic fashion, my mom immediately packed her bags to take us back home. I hesitated. Mom said earnestly, avoiding the problem won't solve anything. Are you planning to die away from home? What a thing to say. I really would. So, with no rights whatsoever, I returned to the country with the child. My dad picked us up at the airport. I cautiously scanned the surroundings and only relaxed when I confirmed that Oliver wasn't around. I admit I didn't want to see him, and I didn't want any entanglements regarding the child. This child had survived countless near-death experiences. He was strong and alive. If he couldn't see this beautiful world because of me, I couldn't bear it. I didn't give birth to him for anyone but for himself. If Oliver was rational enough, he should know that his best choice was to stay away from us, but clearly, he wasn't. He found my house and wanted to see me. At that time, I was holding the little chubby boy and trying to help him burp. Oliver looked at him with intense eyes, gazing at the child without blinking. I frowned and handed the child to my mother. Let's go talk outside. Oliver looked at me with pleading eyes. Diana, can I hold the child? I looked at him expressionlessly. No, if you don't want to talk, then leave. Oliver's face fell. He stared at me blankly, then finally lowered his head. He relented. In the living room, we sat face to face. Oliver opened his mouth and after a long while he said, Diana, I've already sent Ruby for treatment. I sold the house and bought another one in Shiyuan, decorated according to your preferences. We can move in after a while. His words made my brows furrow even deeper. I interrupted him. Oliver, what exactly do you want to say? Oliver looked at me, his expression complex. He said, Diana, can we start over? This was rather ridiculous and I truly laughed. Oliver, what kind of dream are you having? Diana, I love you. After so many years together, I beg you, give me one more chance, Diana, please. Looking at his bent back, my heart stirred. Not at all. He said, I know I've made a terrible mistake and I will spend the rest of my life making up for it. I just hope you'll give me another chance to be with you and the child. I sneered. When the child almost miscarried, I was bedridden and you neglected us. You never asked how we were doing during our divorce. You were just eager to deal with the mess Ruby left behind. Since that's the case, you have no right to call yourself his father. Oliver, don't disturb our lives anymore. When Oliver left, he seemed like a lost soul, and my mom looked like she had something to say but held back. She said, after all, he is Duo's father. What if Duo grows up and wants to see his dad? Looking at my son sleeping peacefully in the crib, I reached out and pinched his cheek. If he grows up and is willing to forgive and acknowledge him, then let him continue that father-son bond. But as far as I'm concerned, I won't forgive. My story with Oliver has ended. From now on, let's part ways amicably and live our own lives happily. Epilogue. Oliver, the greatest fortune in my life was marrying Diana. When I first met Diana, she was dark and thin, with short hair. My mom said this is my little sister, but I felt it was a little brother, a particularly timid little brother. I didn't like playing with timid people. But she was really impressive. Whether it was fighting or playing ball, she was really good at it. I decided to play with her. But slowly, she became paler and cuter, and she grew long hair. It turned out she was indeed a sister. But it didn't matter, whether she was a brother or a sister, we would always be together. That's what I once believed. We accompanied each other for 9 years and promised to be together for a lifetime. But then an unexpected event came so suddenly. My father was reassigned, and I had to move with him, while she went back to her hometown. At that age, we didn't even get a chance to say goodbye. I broke my promise. I was afraid she would hate me and ignore me. I didn't dare to contact her, only able to secretly follow her updates. She was still so full of life, it seemed she was fine whether I was there or not. I felt very sad. At the same time, I realized that I liked her. Oliver liked Diana. When I discovered this fact, my heart couldn't help but race. I knew I had to find her, even if it meant crossing mountains and rivers. We were together. It turned out she liked me too. How wonderful. I urged her to study. I wanted us to attend the same school. But she was playful and easily distracted, which made me very upset, yet she didn't even notice. I was unhappy, but I couldn't bring myself to ignore her. As a result, she didn't perform well on her exams. We couldn't go to the same school, we could only choose the same city. Yet even so, we still saw each other too little. Our conflicts accumulated over time. We both wanted to be good to each other but bore all the unpleasantness alone. When the explosion finally happened, it became uncontrollable. We broke up. I was very sad. I knew she was sad too. But our youthful pride led us to wait for each other to back down. This was the most wrong decision I made in my life. I should have known that when she decided to come find me, she was already extending an olive branch. Why should I care about what she said? I should have held on to her tightly and not let her leave. Clara claimed to be my girlfriend, and I silently approved. I even hoped that this news would reach Diana's ears. I wanted her to know how foolish her words were. But she didn't show up, nor did she say a word. That night, I got drunk, and I ended up with Clara. I was scared, I was terrified. If Diana found out, we would be finished. In a fit of rage, I exposed Clara's pretense of being my girlfriend, manipulating public opinion to drive her away. But it unexpectedly changed the course of so many people's lives. I had thought I could live happily ever after with Diana, but I missed another opportunity. When Clara told me she had a child with me, I refused to accept it. I was even ready to pay her off. But she said she was dying, and her only wish was for me to meet the child. This was the worst-case scenario, and I didn't know what to do. Rationally, I knew I should ignore that child and let her fend for herself. But when I saw her, I hesitated. She was living poorly, thin and malnourished, yet she always looked at me with a sweet, hopeful expression. She was very sensitive and had a profound lack of security, as if any slight disturbance could turn her into a frightened bird. Perhaps it was blood ties. Clara's death didn't make me sad, but when Ruby handed me her only piece of candy, it made me incredibly sorrowful. A life was suffering because of my mistakes. This was original sin. I wanted to take care of this child, but I couldn't lose Diana. How could I balance both? Unless she wasn't my biological daughter. I forged a paternity report and beautified my past with Clara. I deceived Diana for the first time. I was tense all over, afraid she would see through my facade, afraid of losing her. At the same time, I was also afraid the child might let something slip. So when I heard that Diana was pregnant with our child, my instinctive reaction was fear that the child would hear it. I was afraid the child would be stimulated and reveal the truth to her. But in the end, I ended up hurting her. I desperately hoped she would accept that child. I urgently wanted to bury this matter. But things didn't go as planned. She even proposed a divorce. No, I couldn't let that happen. Anything was acceptable, but divorce was not. That child said to me, "Daddy, don't be sad. Just send me to Grandma and Grandpa, I miss them." When I heard those words, I despicably breathed a sigh of relief. I sent that child away. Everything seemed to return to normal. But accidents kept coming, pushing Diana and me toward a dead end. When Diana said that child had deliberately hurt her, I refused to believe it. Even though I had already noticed something was off. But I thought it was natural for a child to seek attention. As long as nothing serious happened, it was fine. Why be so aggressive? Besides, she learned her lesson. But I forgot, she was my child, not Diana's. I had started to approach the child from a paternal emotional perspective, while Diana remained an observer. We were going in opposite directions, drifting further apart. By the time I wanted to turn back, there was no way home. The only thing I could do was let her go and set her free. After Diana and I divorced, that child finally showed a relaxed smile. She looked like a victorious general, enjoying the fruits of her victory. But I felt a chill run down my spine. I sent her to a therapy room, but she resisted. She pleaded with me, looking pitiful. After no results, her expression immediately changed. For the first time, she looked at me with hatred and resentment, cursing and berating me. I couldn't believe such words came from the mouth of an 8-year-old child. I asked the doctor if she could be cured. The doctor said, "Some influences from original families take a lifetime to heal." A lifetime, how terrifying. I once hoped for a win-win situation, but in the end, I ended up with nothing. Diana gave birth to a son, my son with her. When I learned this news, I was thrilled. I thought, since she was willing to give birth to our child, did it mean we still had a chance? But I hadn't anticipated how much she would hate me. I never thought that I had hurt her so deeply. Her words were like knives, mercilessly cutting at my heart. I was in agony, yet she showed no reaction. It turned out that Diana would truly stop loving Oliver. But Oliver couldn't stop loving Diana. All I hoped was for their safety and happiness. In that case, that would be enough for the rest of my life.